Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to some glorious battle or the court of a flamboyant king, but to the grim, grinding reality of 1840s Dublin. Imagine a city that smells of coal smoke and damp wool, a constant, low-level fog that clings to your clothes. The cobblestones under your feet are slick with a mix of rain and something you probably don't want to think too hard about. You're bundled up in layers that are more holes than cloth, and every breath you take is a chill that sinks into your bones. This isn't a history you read about in a textbook, it's a living, breathing place filled with the desperate, the hungry, and the nearly broken. You can almost hear the distant, wailing cries of street hawkers selling nothing anyone can afford. This is a story of survival, of a city bursting at the seams with people who have lost everything. And honestly, you probably won't survive this walk without a serious case of the historical shivers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just arrived in Dublin, and the sheer number of people is the first thing that hits you. The city is a human river, a flood of humanity that has nowhere else to go. These aren't just city folk, they're from the countryside. From places like Mayo and Cork, their faces etched with a kind of weary resignation you've never seen before. They have nothing, just the clothes on their backs and the deep, gnawing hunger that you've come to know so well. The famine, what they call the Great Hunger, has chased them here, an invisible force pushing them from their homes. For a lot of them, Dublin was the last hope, a beacon promising work, food, anything but the slow, agonizing starvation of the fields. They came in droves, by foot, by cart, a constant stream of humanity flowing into the city's already crowded streets. The city's population swelled by tens of thousands in just a few short years. It's an interesting historical fact that the population of Dublin itself wasn't directly a famine casualty. In fact, it grew massively as a result of the famine. The city acted as a sort of bottleneck, trapping people between the failing land and the sea, which was their only way out. And not everyone could afford that passage. You see a group of children huddled in an alleyway, their faces pale and thin, their eyes too old for their years. They're not playing, just sitting, conserving energy, watching the world with a kind of dull, vacant stare. It's a scene that's repeated on every street corner. Their parents are likely out there somewhere, trying to beg or steal a potato, a crust of bread, anything to keep them alive for one more day. The poverty isn't just a lack of things, it's a physical presence. A weight that settles over the whole city. You feel it in the air. You see it in the way people walk. A slow, shuffling gait born of exhaustion. Historians still argue whether the scale of this migration was anticipated by authorities. Some say they knew the numbers would be immense. Others that they were completely blindsided by the sheer volume of people flooding in. One quirky tidbit from the time is that some of the richer Dubliners, terrified of catching diseases from the poor, would carry handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or cloves, believing it would ward off the famine fever that was sweeping through the streets. A nice thought, but about as effective as trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. The air is thick with the stories of the countryside, stories you've heard 100 times now. The potatoes turning to black mush in the fields. The smell of rot hanging in the air like a curse. You can almost picture it. A vast, dark stain spreading across the green Irish landscape. And now, all that rot has flowed into the city. The cold has a special kind of sharpness here. A damp chill that seems to go straight into your bones. No matter how much you try to huddle into yourself. You've heard the stories, of course. The ones from the countryside about the blight. But you never truly understood until you got here. Until you saw the reality of it. The potato, the humble spud, was everything. It wasn't just a side dish for millions of people. It was the main course. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A nutritional cornerstone. An average adult male could eat between 12 to 14 pounds of them a day. Think about that for a second. It's a staggering amount. A testament to how utterly reliant the population was on a single crop. And now, it's gone. The crop failure began in 1845. A faint whisper at first. A few blackened leaves. A strange smell. But by 1846 and 1847, it was a full-blown catastrophe. The potatoes were simply rotting in the ground. A slimy, putrid mess. You see people on the street, holding out their hands, and sometimes you can see the faint, dark stain of a failed potato harvest on their fingers. A last, desperate proof of their former livelihood. The hunger isn't just an empty stomach. It's a constant, low-grade ache that wears you down. A hollowness that makes it hard to think, hard to move. It's the kind of hunger that makes everything else, your dignity, your hopes, your memories, seem like luxuries you can no longer afford. You see a man trying to sell a single turnip. His voice a hoarse whisper. The price he's asking is more than you or anyone around him could possibly pay. The market, the very idea of a market, has broken down. People don't have coins, they have desperation. Historians still argue whether the British government's initial response to the blight was hampered more by a belief in laissez-faire economics or by a simple, staggering ignorance of the scale of the disaster. The government's early relief efforts, like importing Indian corn from America, were too little and often too late, and the corn itself was difficult to cook and even harder for people's delicate systems to digest. It was called Peel's brimstone by some of the starving Irish. A testament to how unhelpful it felt. A quirky fact from the time is that some people, in their desperation, tried to eat the slimy, rotted potatoes, leading to severe illness and sometimes death. It's a grim testament to the absolute lengths people would go to. You pass a group of men sitting on the curb, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They're not talking, just staring into the middle distance. They're farmers. You can tell by the calloused hands and the deep lines on their faces. They've come to the city hoping for a miracle, but all they've found is more of the same. The streets are a reflection of the fields, an urban landscape of decay and want. You can't escape it. The hunger is in the air, in the eyes of every person you pass. It's a silent language, a shared understanding of a tragedy so immense it defies words. You feel your own stomach rumble, a quiet complaint that seems to echo the city's greater suffering. You remember a small, funny story from before the famine. A time when a neighbor of yours, a fellow farmer, had a pet pig he'd named Napoleon. He was so proud of that pig, and he'd always say, with a wink, that he was raising him to be a fine ham for Christmas dinner. The famine came, and you heard that he had to sell Napoleon for a pittance just to buy a few bags of Indian corn. It's a small, sad memory, but it feels like a monument to a world that no longer exists. A world of small jokes and simple plans that were so thoroughly wiped away. And as you walk on, the chill in the air and the ache in your gut are a constant reminder of how precarious life can be when a single, tiny fungus decides to rewrite history. The hunger is a constant companion, but so is the cold. And the dirt. It's a profound, all-encompassing filth that seems to seep into everything. A layer of grime that you can't escape. You've walked into the heart of the city's poorest districts. The labyrinthine alleys of places like the Liberties or the Coombe. This isn't the clean, Georgian Dublin of the wealthy, with its stately brick homes and wide, elegant streets. This is a city of slums, of narrow, twisting lanes where the sun rarely reaches the ground. The houses here are what they call tenements, and you can see why. They were once fine, single-family homes, but now they've been carved up, floor by floor, room by room, into a dozen or more tiny, crowded apartments. You can see laundry strung across the street on lines. A strange, pathetic festive banner in an otherwise gray world. You duck into a narrow alley and a pungent smell assaults you. It's a mix of rotting food, human waste, and unwashed bodies. You can feel the eyes on you, watching from the dark doorways and grimy windows. Life here is lived in public, but it's also a deeply private struggle. You see a woman trying to mend a coat with a needle so thin it's almost invisible. Her face is a mask of concentration, a tiny act of creation in a world of decay. You also see 3 or 4 families sharing a single room, the space divided by nothing more than thin, tattered blankets. It's a shocking historical fact that some of these tenement rooms could house as many as 20 or 30 people, all crammed into a space no bigger than a modern living room. And remember that smell? It's everywhere because there's little or no sanitation. The cesspools overflow, and the few privies are shared by dozens, if not hundreds, of people. This isn't just a lack of comfort, it's a breeding ground for every disease you can imagine. Historians still argue whether these extreme living conditions were a direct result of the famine or a pre-existing problem that was simply exacerbated by the influx of refugees. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The city's poor were already living in squalor. But the famine turned a bad situation into an apocalyptic one. One quirky tidbit is the concept of night lodgers. Some families would rent out half of their bed, yes, half, to someone else for a few pennies a night, with the new lodgers sleeping head to foot with them to save space. It's a surreal and desperate solution, a testament to how every single resource, no matter how small or personal, was monetized for survival. You hear the constant coughs from inside the buildings, a sound that seems to echo the general suffering. The sound of a baby crying is not a sound of distress, but a kind of background noise, a constant, low-level hum that the residents have just learned to live with. You see a man trying to read a newspaper by the light of a single candle stub. He's oblivious to the chaos around him, lost in a world of words, a fleeting escape from the hard reality of the present. The filth and the lack of privacy are just another layer of the humiliation. Your life is not your own. Your very body is not your own. You share your air, your space, your germs, with people who are also just trying to survive. There's no room for secrets, no space for solitude. It's a kind of forced intimacy that erodes the spirit just as surely as the hunger and the cold wear down the body. You look up at the sky, a small rectangle of bruised gray visible between the tall, looming buildings, and for a second, you feel a deep, crushing loneliness, a sense of being utterly alone in a sea of suffering humanity. The hunger and the filth of the streets are bad enough, but there's a place that's even worse, a place that strikes a terror into the hearts of the poor unlike any other. It's a place you see a constant stream of people approaching, their faces a mixture of fear and defeat, the workhouse. They stand as a grim historical fact, towering brick institutions with a forbidding, institutional look. These weren't hospitals or shelters, but a last resort for the absolutely destitute. The philosophy behind them was to make life inside so miserable that no one would enter unless they had no other choice. And believe me, that philosophy worked. You watch as a young family, a mother, father, and two small children, stands hesitantly at the gate. The father, a gaunt, skeletal figure, holds the mother's hand. The children look confused, their eyes wide and frightened. To enter the workhouse was to give up everything you had left. Your freedom, your identity, even your family. The moment you stepped inside, your family was immediately separated. Men went to one ward, women to another, and children to a third. You would be stripped, washed, and issued a rough, scratchy uniform. Your old clothes, your only connection to your former life, were burned. It was a kind of living death, a way of erasing who you were so you could become another anonymous, starving soul. Historians still argue whether the workhouse system was an intentional act of cruelty or a misguided attempt at a deterrent for what the government saw as lazy, poor people. The reality for the people entering was that it didn't really matter what the intention was. The result was the same. The work inside was backbreaking and often pointless. You could be tasked with breaking stones for hours on end or picking oakum, which is basically unraveling old ropes for their fibers. The food was a meager, watery gruel, barely enough to keep you alive. A quirky tidbit is that the workhouse diet was so infamous that a common expression of the time was, "Thank God it's not workhouse gruel." You feel a shiver of revulsion as you look at the stark, impersonal facade of the building. The air around it seems colder, heavier, as if all the misery inside had seeped out and settled around its walls. You can hear the sounds of shouting and the low, constant moans from inside. You see a man being thrown out of the gate by two stern-faced wardens. He stumbles to the ground, his face bruised and his clothes torn. He's weeping, and you hear him mutter something about his wife still being inside. He'd probably tried to fight for a little more food or to see his family. And this was the consequence. The workhouse was a trap. Many people died inside, not from starvation but from diseases that spread like wildfire in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Typhus and cholera were rampant, and the infirmaries were often just places where people went to die. The people in the workhouses were seen by many as a drain on society, and a lot of the public opinion was against providing them with any comfort. You hear a well-dressed gentleman passing by mutter to his companion, "They brought this on themselves." Why should we feed them? It's a sickening sentiment, one you've heard repeated more times than you can count. The workhouse was a place for the forgotten. A place where people were not only punished for their poverty but also for their very existence. The thought of ever having to step through those doors is enough to make you turn and walk in the other direction. But the gnawing hunger in your stomach whispers that it might be your only choice. So you've avoided the workhouse for now. But the reality of the streets is just as brutal. Just in a different way. Survival here is a full-time, high-stakes game. Every day is a struggle to find enough to eat, to earn enough for a night's lodging, and to avoid the wrong kind of attention. You're constantly walking, always on the move, because standing still means you're a target for thieves, for the police, or for the kind of despair that can completely freeze you in place. You see other people on the street, and a quick glance tells you their story. The ones with a faint smile and a spark in their eye are probably new arrivals, still holding onto a sliver of hope. The ones with the vacant stare, the ones who shuffle along as if in a daze, are the veterans, the ones who have been here too long, their souls worn thin by the constant struggle. You've learned to scrounge. The gutters are your grocery store. The overflowing bins are your pantry. It's a disgusting business, but hunger has a way of making you forget about things like pride and disgust. You see a half-eaten crust of bread lying in the street, and for a split second, a primal impulse takes over. You race a street dog for it. A quick, humiliating scramble that you thankfully win. It's hard and stale, but it's food, and it makes a difference. This is a far cry from the life you knew. A life where you knew where your next meal was coming from. That's a historical fact you're living right now. A complete and total breakdown of a society's food system, which forces people into unimaginable circumstances. The Great Famine wasn't just a food shortage, it was an economic collapse. A social collapse. And a spiritual one. You try to tell yourself a joke you heard once, about a man who tried to sell his shadow for a penny. But you can't even remember the punchline anymore. The laughter is gone. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of soup kitchens by private charities and religious organizations was an effective temporary solution or a dangerous crutch that prevented a more systematic, government-led response. For you, on the street, it's neither a political debate nor a historical footnote. It's a source of hope. You've heard of a soup kitchen run by the Quakers on Meath Street, and you begin to walk in that direction. The Quakers, a quirky tidbit about them, were known for their tireless and non-judgmental work during the famine, often providing aid when others would not, and they were among the first to send relief ships to Ireland. Their aid wasn't tied to any religious conversion, which was a remarkable thing at the time. You pass a group of men gathered around a fire in a rusty barrel. They're arguing over a job, something about loading a ship at the docks. One of them, a huge man with a scarred face, says, "I'll do it for half a loaf and a shilling." "So I will." It's an insane price, but you know someone will take it. The competition for work is fierce, and the work itself is often little more than a form of slow torture. You've heard of men working for a few potatoes and a place to sleep in a warehouse for a night, only to be turned away the next morning with nothing. The hunger and desperation are a currency, and you're just another piece of it. It's a game of inches, a daily grind to make it to the next day, and the next. You see a small girl trying to sell a few withered flowers. Her voice a reedy whisper. She's probably a few years younger than you, but she looks older. You don't have a single coin to give her, and the guilt is a sharp, cold jab in your gut. This is the new normal. As if the hunger wasn't bad enough, there's a new dread that stalks the streets. A quiet killer that moves through the alleys and tenements with a horrifying speed. It's disease, and in 1840s Dublin, it's a constant, terrifying reality. The sheer number of people crammed together in unsanitary conditions is a perfect breeding ground. You see it everywhere, in the sallow faces, the vacant stares, the sudden, violent retching in the street. Typhus, often called famine fever, and cholera are the two most common killers. And they don't discriminate. They take the young, the old, the strong, and the weak. It's a historical fact that typhus alone claimed more lives during the Great Famine than starvation did. It's carried by lice, which thrive in the dirty, crowded conditions of the tenements. And once it takes hold, it spreads like wildfire. You pass a small, makeshift hospital in a converted warehouse. The air around it is heavy with the smell of sickness and death. A woman sits on the steps outside, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. She's just lost a child. You can tell. It's not a question of if you'll get sick, but when your own body feels weak and vulnerable. You can feel a small rash on your skin, a phantom itch that makes you paranoid. Is it a sign? Are the lice already on you? You see a man with a feverish, glazed look in his eyes stumbling down the street. He's delirious, muttering to himself, and people are giving him a wide berth, a look of primal fear in their eyes. They know what's coming next. Historians still argue whether the epidemics of typhus and cholera were an inevitable consequence of the famine or if they were made worse by the inadequate and disorganized public health response. The medical community at the time was overwhelmed, and their treatments were often little more than guesswork. One quirky tidbit is that people would try to ward off disease with folk remedies. You've heard of people carrying potatoes in their pockets to ward off rheumatism and others using strange concoctions of herbs and river water to try and cure the fever. It's a testament to how utterly helpless people felt in the face of this invisible enemy. You pass a small funeral procession, if you can even call it that. It's just a man carrying a small, blanket-wrapped body in his arms, his face a mask of grief. There are no coffins for the poor, and there are too many dead to even have a proper burial. The fear of disease is a constant background hum to the hunger. It's a different kind of terror. A silent one that you can't fight with your hands. You can't outrun it, and you can't hide from it. It's in the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the bodies you huddle next to for warmth. You remember a joke you heard once, about a man who said the only thing cheaper than a potato was a funeral. It wasn't funny then, and it certainly isn't funny now. The laughter is still gone, replaced by the sound of coughing and the constant, dull ache of dread. In the face of so much death and desperation, it's easy to think that everyone has given up, but you start to see the pockets of hope, the small, overworked engines of compassion trying to stem the tide. These are the charity organizations, the religious groups, and the small-scale philanthropists trying to make a difference. A historical fact that stands out is that groups like the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, were some of the most consistent and effective sources of relief. They weren't just handing out soup, they were also organizing large-scale food imports, providing seeds for new crops, and even funding fishing boats to give people a source of income and protein. You see one of their soup kitchens, a long line of people stretching down a back alley. Their faces a mixture of exhaustion and a kind of quiet, patient resolve. The soup itself is little more than thin broth, but for the people in line, it's a lifeline. It's a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the gnawing hunger. You hear a man in the line talking to the person next to him. He's talking about how the soup is a blessing, but it's not enough. It fills your belly for an hour, but it doesn't fill your pockets. He says with a sigh. It's a sad reality that most of the relief was just a temporary fix. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound. Another quirky tidbit from the time is that some of the soup kitchens were a spectacle for the rich. You'd see carriages filled with well-dressed gentlemen and ladies stopping to watch the poor receive their handouts. It was a bizarre kind of poverty tourism, a way for the wealthy to feel a sense of moral superiority without ever having to get their hands dirty. You see a carriage pass by now, the occupants' faces peeking out from behind a lace curtain, their expressions a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled disgust. It's a surreal, infuriating sight. Historians still argue whether the scale of private charity efforts ultimately helped or hindered the larger response to the famine. Some scholars believe that the private charities created an impression that the crisis was being handled, which allowed the government to continue its inadequate response. Others argue that without the charities, the death toll would have been immeasurably higher. You don't know the answer. And honestly, you don't care. All you know is that the soup in your bowl, however thin, is the only thing standing between you and complete collapse. You slurp it down, a small, quiet act of survival. You've learned to eat fast, to not savor it, because to savor something is to be reminded of how little you have. And the sound of other people eating, the slurping and the quiet sighs of relief, is a chorus of shared suffering and momentary comfort. The relief efforts, while a blessing, also brought their own set of problems. They were often overwhelmed, and fights would break out in the lines. People would lie, cheat, and steal just to get a spot. The charity workers, often volunteers, were pushed to their limits. both emotionally and physically. You see a young woman in a Quaker bonnet, her face pale with exhaustion, trying to break up a small scuffle between two men. She looks a decade older than she probably is. The suffering is contagious, and it seems to wear down even the people trying to fight it. You're grateful for the help, of course, but it's a gratitude tinged with a deep sense of despair, because the line for the soup is a reminder that you're just another mouth to feed. Another desperate soul in a city of them. As you trudge through the streets, the political landscape is not just something you read about in newspapers, it's a harsh, inescapable reality that shapes your very existence. You hear whispers and loud, angry arguments about the British government's response to the famine, a response that, from your perspective on the street, feels non-existent. A historical fact you've heard repeated is that the British government, guided by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel and later Lord John Russell, initially clung to the principle of laissez-faire economics, which essentially meant they believed the market would correct itself and that government intervention was bad. You can hear a man in a pub, his voice thick with a mixture of alcohol and rage, railing against the London lords, who believe the poor should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's an infuriating and cruel philosophy when you have no boots and no bootstraps to speak of. The government's initial response was to provide aid through public works, a scheme that had you or anyone else work on building roads or other projects in exchange for a meager wage. You see the results of this policy everywhere. Roads that seem to lead to nowhere. Walls built around empty fields. A kind of pointless, soul-crushing labor. The pay, a quirky tidbit you've heard, was often so low that it wasn't enough to buy food for a family. One man you spoke to on the street said, "I worked all day and came home with enough to buy a few handfuls of grain. And my wife and children were still starving." It's a sad joke, a cruel parody of help. Historians still argue whether the government's response was a result of genuine, albeit misguided, economic theory or a deliberate policy of neglect. The Irish, for their part, believed it was the latter, and the resentment and anger you feel on the streets are a testament to that belief. You pass a group of men selling old newspapers. They're not selling them for the news, but for the paper itself. A few layers of insulation for the night. You see a headline, "Government debates further relief." The word debates itself feels like a slap in the face. While they debate, people die. The contrast between the distant, academic discussion of policy and the immediate, visceral reality of starvation is jarring. You hear a story about a man who tried to walk to the docks to find work on a ship to America. But he collapsed from hunger and exhaustion before he even made it halfway. His body was found by the side of the road, and the only thing on him was a copy of the day's newspaper. A final, bitter irony. The government did eventually get more involved, with the British Relief Association and the Irish Famine Relief Fund raising money. But by then it was too late for many. The damage was done. The neglect and the perceived cruelty of the response created a deep, festering wound that would last for generations. The people on the street don't talk about politics in a theoretical sense. They talk about it as a personal insult. A betrayal. You hear a woman whisper that, "The Queen has forgotten us." And you can see in her eyes that she genuinely believes it. It's a heavy thought. A belief that your own government, your own country, has turned its back on you. And as you walk, the whispers of anger and despair are a constant, low-level drone, a kind of human buzz that is far more powerful than any political speech. The famine isn't just a political crisis or a food shortage. It's a social and cultural cataclysm that's rewriting the rules of life itself. The customs, traditions, and even the language that held communities together are being slowly, painfully eroded. You see it in the way people interact with each other. A historical fact you've come to learn is that before the famine, Irish society, especially in the rural areas, was built on a web of interconnected relationships. People relied on each other, on the shared labor of the harvest, on the collective celebrations of weddings and births. Now, that web is fraying. You see people on the street turning away from each other, their faces hardened with a kind of self-preservation that leaves no room for kindness. The old bonds are gone, replaced by a brutal competition for scraps. The language itself is a casualty. The vast majority of people who spoke Irish were in the rural areas, and they were the ones who were hit hardest by the famine. You can hear the language being spoken in whispers in the alleys, a dying sound in a city that is predominantly English-speaking. A quirky tidbit from the time is that some people who had to flee the countryside for the city would deliberately stop speaking Irish, believing that it marked them as uncivilized and would make it harder to get help or find work. It was a tragic, small act of assimilation, a way of trying to disappear in a new, hostile world. You hear a mother trying to teach her child a nursery rhyme in English. Her pronunciation clunky and unsure. It's a heartbreaking scene, a clear sign of a culture being forced to change to survive. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Irish language was a direct result of the famine or an acceleration of a trend that was already happening. The famine, though, unquestionably delivered a final, devastating blow. The death of the language is a kind of silent tragedy. It's not just a loss of words, it's a loss of history, of stories, of a way of seeing the world that is now fading. You feel a pang of sadness as you hear a man muttering a prayer in Irish. His voice raw with emotion. It's a prayer you can't fully understand, but you know it's a prayer for a world that no longer exists. The social fabric is also unraveling in more obvious ways. You see families breaking up, not just for the workhouse, but for survival. Parents are sending their children away, hoping they can find work as servants in wealthier households or, more tragically, just hoping they'll be better off without them. The idea of family is no longer a source of strength, it's a source of pain. A constant reminder of the people you can't feed, the people you've failed. You hear a man selling his wife's wedding ring for a loaf of bread, his face contorted in a mix of shame and desperation. The ring, a symbol of a promise and a future, is now just a few bites of food. And as you walk, you feel the weight of all this change. A quiet sorrow that seems to permeate every corner of the city. The thought of the sea, once a source of dread and uncertainty, has now become a siren song for thousands. The promise of a new life. A life where potatoes don't rot in the ground and hunger isn't a constant companion, is the only thing that keeps many people going. And so, they head to the docks. To the coffin ships. A grim historical fact of the famine. These were not luxury liners, they were often old, decrepit cargo ships, packed with as many people as possible. There holds a nightmare of disease and despair. You see a family, a young couple with a baby, looking at the ships docked in the harbor. The woman is crying silently, and the man has a look of grim determination on his face. This is it. This is their only option. The journey was as terrifying as it was dangerous. People were crammed into the holds with little ventilation, and the sanitation was non-existent. A quirky tidbit from the time is that some of the ship captains, in a twisted sort of joke, would charge people extra for a breathing ticket, a way of saying you were paying for the right to a little more space. The diseases that were rampant on the streets of Dublin, typhus, cholera, dysentery, found a perfect breeding ground on these ships. A large percentage of the people who boarded these ships never made it to their destination. They were literally dying in the thousands, their bodies thrown overboard to lighten the load. The ships were given their grim nickname because of the sheer number of deaths that occurred during the passage. Historians still argue whether the shipowners were motivated by sheer greed or if they were simply overwhelmed by the volume of people and had no idea how to properly manage the mass emigration. For the people on the boats, the answer was obvious. They were simply a commodity, a number to be packed into the hold. You hear a woman talking about her brother, who had left on one of the coffin ships a few months ago. She hasn't heard from him since, and a part of her knows, with a kind of quiet certainty, that she never will. The sea is a vast, empty graveyard, and the ships are its hearses. And yet, for all the horror, the draw of a new life is too powerful to resist. You see people selling off their last remaining possessions, a family heirloom, a worn-out coat, a pair of boots, just to buy a ticket. The desperation is so profound that the terrifying prospect of the journey is still preferable to the slow, agonizing death they're facing here. The emigration from Ireland during and after the famine was a seismic event, changing the demographics of both Ireland and the countries they went to, particularly America and Canada. You think about all the people who have left, and all the people who are still leaving, and you realize that a part of Ireland is bleeding away, leaving a gaping wound that may never heal. The city is full of goodbyes, of tearful farewells and empty promises to write. The silence that follows the departure of a ship is a heavy, painful thing. a hollow where a life used to be. And as you walk, you feel the pull of that distant land. A new world that promises a future but demands a brutal journey in return. As you continue your slow, shuffling walk, you can't escape the dark influence of the landlords. In the rural areas, the land was their power, and they held the keys to life and death. Now, in the city, their power is still immense, but it's expressed in a more brutal, direct way. You see the signs everywhere. A door boarded up with a red E for evicted painted on it. A pile of meager possessions left on the street. A family huddling in a doorway, their faces pale with shock and cold. This is a historical fact that is still a point of intense pain in Irish history. The mass evictions. When the poor couldn't pay their rent, and with the famine, no one can. The landlords had them thrown out of their homes. It wasn't just about a missed payment, it was a way of clearing the land, of getting rid of the people who were seen as a burden. You pass an old woman, her face a web of wrinkles, sitting on a small, worn-out trunk. She looks at you with eyes that have seen too much. And she mutters, "They came and they threw us out like dogs. After 100 years on that land, they threw us out." It's a gut-wrenching scene. A visceral display of cruelty. A quirky tidbit is that some landlords, to save money, would literally knock down the houses after evicting the tenants so they couldn't come back. They'd tear down the roofs and walls, leaving the people to a fate of exposure and death. It was a kind of final, brutal act of dispossession. Historians still argue whether the landlord's actions were an act of self-preservation, they had their own debts to pay, or an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty. Whatever the reason, the result was the same, a new wave of homeless and destitute people flooding the city. You hear a small, sad joke from a man trying to sell a few sticks of firewood. He says, "At least my landlord didn't take the floorboards. I'll be back for those in the spring." It's a bitter laugh, a gallows humor that's all too common in the streets now. The landlords aren't just a distant political force, they're the embodiment of your personal failures. A reminder that your existence is entirely dependent on someone else's mercy, or lack thereof. You see the contrast in the city itself. The stately Georgian homes of the wealthy landlords are pristine, their windows gleaming, their doors polished. You can hear the sounds of piano music and laughter from inside. And just a few streets away, the tenements are overflowing, the people are starving, and the children are dying. The evictions created a deep and lasting sense of injustice and resentment. The Irish had a deep connection to the land, a connection that was both spiritual and practical. To be taken from it was to lose a part of yourself. The landlords, many of whom were English or Anglo-Irish, became a symbol of a cruel, uncaring colonial power. And as you walk, you feel the anger building in the streets, a quiet, simmering rage that may one day boil over. The hunger isn't just a physical thing, it's a mental one. It's a kind of desperate logic that replaces all others. It makes you do things you never would have imagined. And for some, that desperation leads to crime. You see it everywhere. In the quiet, furtive acts of thievery. A man grabbing a loaf of bread from an unattended cart and running. The baker's cries of protest, a futile sound in the chaos. A young boy trying to steal a few turnips from a street vendor, his eyes wide with a combination of fear and hunger. This isn't the grand larceny of the rich, it's the small, pathetic crime of the starving. It's a historical fact that during the famine, petty crime, especially food-related crime, skyrocketed. The jails filled up with people who had stolen a few potatoes or a piece of bread. Their only real crime being that they were starving. You feel a deep sympathy for them, even as you yourself are constantly on guard. A quirky tidbit is that the police, known as the Dublin Metropolitan Police, often had to let people go because the jails were simply too full. They would just turn a blind eye to the small thefts, knowing that the person would be back in the streets a few hours later, just as hungry and just as desperate. This wasn't an act of kindness so much as a kind of bureaucratic surrender to the overwhelming scale of the problem. It's a sad kind of mercy. Historians still argue whether the increase in crime was a reflection of a breakdown in morality or a simple, tragic act of survival. For you, the answer is clear. When your stomach is empty and your child is crying, morality is a luxury you can't afford. You pass a small boy, no older than 6, trying to pickpocket a passing gentleman. The gentleman catches him, and instead of calling the police, He just sighs, shakes his head, and gives the boy a single copper coin. The boy's eyes fill with tears of gratitude, and he runs off. A small victory in a world of losses. It's a rare moment of kindness. A fleeting bit of humanity in a city that seems to have forgotten how to be human. But even that kindness is fleeting. You see a man being led away in chains. His face bruised and his hands caked with dirt. He's being taken to jail. Probably for stealing something insignificant. There's no compassion for him. He's a criminal, and he'll be treated as such. The criminal justice system, designed to deal with a functioning society, is completely overwhelmed by a starving one. The courts are a revolving door of the desperate, and the judges are a mix of exasperation and weariness. You remember a joke you heard, a dark one, about a man who walked into a police station and told the sergeant, "I've just stolen a loaf of bread." The sergeant, tired and overworked, just sighed and said, "Well, why don't you steal another one? Then you can at least get a decent meal out of it." It's a joke, but it feels like the truth. The law has broken down, and the only rule left is the rule of the empty stomach. As you have seen, the famine isn't just a moment in time. It's an event that is fundamentally changing the very fabric of Dublin. The city itself is a testament to this change. A grim, sprawling metropolis that is now a holding pen for the dispossessed. The demographics are shifting at a dizzying pace. You see people from all over Ireland, their accents and mannerisms telling a story of a place you've only heard about in whispers. A historical fact you've come to understand is that the famine caused a massive internal migration, with the rural population plummeting and the urban population, particularly in Dublin, swelling to unprecedented numbers. The city's landscape is now defined by the contrast between the old and the new, the clean and the filthy. The once elegant Georgian squares are now surrounded by a sea of slums and makeshift encampments. You walk past a church, a grand, imposing building with stained glass windows and a high, wooden door. A funeral is taking place, but it's not a solemn, quiet affair. It's a loud, desperate thing, with a family mourning a loved one who has been lost to the fever. You see another funeral procession a few streets away. This one a single man with a cart. No coffin, just a body wrapped in a sheet. This is the new normal. Death is a constant, and it has lost its ritual and its dignity. A quirky tidbit from the time is that some of the graveyards were so full that bodies had to be buried in mass graves, with new layers of soil being added on top of the old ones. It's a macabre kind of landscaping, a way of fitting an unbearable number of dead into a finite amount of space. Historians still argue whether the scale of the famine's impact was a temporary shock or a permanent change. For you, it feels like the latter. The city's character has been forever altered. It's no longer just a hub of commerce and culture. It's a city of ghosts, of people who have lost their homes, their families, and their way of life. The silence in the countryside, you've heard, is a deafening thing. The villages are empty, the cottages are in ruins, and the fields are overgrown. The population of Ireland would never fully recover from the famine, a loss of millions of people who either died or emigrated. The city of Dublin, for better or worse, is a repository for the sorrow and the memory of that loss. And as you walk, you feel the weight of all those absent lives, a kind of phantom population that is as much a part of the city as the living. The famine isn't just a historical event, it's a deep, psychological wound that will continue to echo for generations. You can feel it in the air, a kind of collective trauma that has settled over the city like a heavy fog. You see it in the way people react to food, a deep-seated fear of scarcity that will likely never leave them. A historical fact that is still a point of study is the concept of a famine mentality, a lasting psychological effect on people who lived through it. They would hoard food, even when they had enough, and they would feel a profound guilt about eating when others were starving. It's a sickness of the soul, a quiet madness that goes beyond a physical ailment. You pass a small, scruffy boy who is meticulously collecting every single crumb that has fallen from a baker's cart. He's not eating them, he's putting them in a small, tattered bag, a kind of private pantry for a future that may never come. He is acting on a primal fear, a fear that has been seared into his DNA. A quirky tidbit is that even generations after the famine, many Irish families would have a deep aversion to wasting food. The saying, "waste not, want not," became a kind of religious mantra. A small, daily act of remembrance for a tragedy that shaped their very being. Historians still argue whether the lasting psychological effects of the famine were a contributing factor to the high rates of emigration in the years that followed. For you, the answer seems obvious. How can you stay in a place that has been the site of such a profound and personal tragedy? You hear a man talking to himself. A low, mumbled conversation about a dream he had where the potatoes were ripe and ready for harvest. He's recounting the dream with a kind of desperate, vivid detail, and you realize that he's not just dreaming of food, he's dreaming of a world that has been lost. A world of bounty and certainty that is gone forever. The famine didn't just kill people, it killed a way of life. A sense of security, a confidence that the future would be better than the past. And as you walk, you feel the weight of all that loss. A quiet, lingering sorrow that is the famine's true legacy. You've walked the streets, felt the cold, and carried the hunger. You've seen the desperation of the famine-struck city. But now it's time to slowly, gently, walk away. The images in your mind are still vivid. The faces of the starving, the sounds of the sick, the smell of the city's despair. But as you turn down a quieter street, away from the chaos of the docks and the tenements, the sounds begin to fade. The street becomes less crowded, the air a little cleaner. The constant drone of suffering starts to recede, becoming a faint whisper in the distance. The historical fact is that the famine, while a devastating event, was also a catalyst for change. It led to a permanent shift in Ireland's population, its social structure, and its relationship with Great Britain. The city, though scarred, would eventually rebuild itself. The memories would be passed down from generation to generation. A quiet, mournful story told around the hearth. A quirky tidbit you can think about is that the tradition of telling stories, of keeping the past alive, became even more important after the famine. The stories weren't just a form of entertainment, they were a way of honoring the dead, of making sure that their suffering wasn't forgotten. Historians still argue whether the memory of the famine, and the bitterness it engendered, was the single most important factor in the push for Irish independence decades later. It certainly played a huge part. As you walk, the air grows still and a soft quiet settles over everything. The city, like your mind, is beginning to quiet down. The streets are empty now. You're just walking, your feet a slow, quiet shuffle on the cobblestones. The fear and the hunger have been replaced by a deep, profound weariness. You feel the weight of all that suffering. And it's a heavy, solemn thing, but you're no longer a part of it. You're a witness, a visitor, and now you're leaving. The darkness of the alleyways is giving way to the faint, ethereal glow of a single street lamp, casting a warm, gentle light on the path ahead. The hard edges of the buildings are softening, and the air smells of cool, damp earth and a distant, forgotten promise of rain. You feel a gentle sense of peace, a quiet kind of relief. The past is still there, just behind you, but it's no longer your present. It's a story, a history, something you can now put away. The journey is over, and it's time to rest. You can let go of the chill in your bones, the rumble in your stomach, and the fear in your heart. They're all just a memory now. The journey is complete. The history has been told. You can rest now. The sounds of the streets are fading. The cries of the hungry and the sick are gone. All that's left is the soft hum of the fan, the stillness of the room, and the quiet comfort of your own bed. The world of 1840s Dublin is far, far away, so close your eyes. Let the rest of the world melt away. There is nothing to worry about, just quiet, and darkness, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing.